In Vermont, our mountains are basically natural towers to get the wind turbines up high where the wind blows.
My question is, how many miles of ridgeline is it going to take to reach your 40% capacity?
I don't think you want to hear my answer.
Yes, I'd like everybody to hear the answer.
I'll tell you, it's 200 miles of ridgeline that needs to be developed. But we have a lot of ridgelines in Vermont.
And welcome to the second roundtable discussion of the Peak Keepers. This is a continuing discussion, a panel of Vermont scientists, educators, and journalists who are part of the group Peak Keepers, and it's focused on the need to protect and promote Vermont's mountain ecosystems, a natural resource that's under threat. And Sue Morse, you're one of the co-founders of Peak Keepers, and why don't you tell us a little bit about the inspiration for this roundtable and the organization Peak Keepers?
Well, a number of us got together and decided that what we really needed to do was to bring together a variety of people, as you say, scientists and educators and other specialists to talk about wind energy and its impacts on our mountains and really bring the science and the best of our technical knowledge to bear on the subject, because I think a lot of people out there who have been led to believe that wind facilities on top of mountains is a good idea really don't know the other side of the story. It hasn't been adequately told, and we really felt that that was important. So that's what we're hoping to do.
Well, and so we have with us today Tom Butler, who is the co-editor of this really thought-provoking book, Energy, Overdevelopment, and the Delusion of Endless Growth. And next to him is Dr. Steve Young, well-known botanist and founder of the Center for Northern Studies. He's from Wolcott, Tom is from Huntington. And Sue Morse, wildlife ecologist and naturalist and author. She's one of the co-founders of Peak Keepers from Jericho. And finally, we have Bruce Post, and he's the former aide to Vermont Senators Stafford and Jeffords, and also Governor Snelling, and he's from Essex. So the format is we're going to start with sort of an opening from each of our panelists, and then we'll get into more of a discussion. So we'll start with Tom. And Tom, why don't you tell us, if you wouldn't mind, what is our current energy economy?
Well, in a word, it's toxic. It is toxic to wild nature. It's increasingly toxic to human welfare, human health. And of course, on a global sense, it's toxic to the global atmosphere and the climate. And
so can you help put it into context? Your book is very sort of globally focused. You've really captured in photographs quite powerfully what is happening to our planet. And so can you talk more about what is happening with Vermont's energy economy and bring it down to...
And how that's tied in.
Yeah.
Sure. Most of us don't really well, perhaps present company accepted, most of us don't really think about energy very much as long as the lights come on and there's gas in the tank. Maybe at the end of the month when the fuel oil bill comes, we give it some thought, or when there is some energy-related horrific disaster like the Deepwater Horizon accident and spill or the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear meltdown. But pretty much then our attention dissipates. But it is energy. Cheap, abundant, perpetually available energy, which really supports the entire scaffolding of civilization. The entire infrastructure of modernity depends on these very inexpensive, abundant energy resources. And essentially now there's something of a feedback loop, because even as energy supports this scaffolding of civilization, it requires that entire scaffolding to keep the energy flowing. That is, all of the mining, the drilling, the processing, refining, the power generation, and the transmission infrastructure, all to keep that global industrial growth economy humming, which depends upon energy. And as nice as it would be to be a little insular place like Vermont, a little green island in that sea of destruction, that's simply not the case. Our entire energy economy is inextricably tied with these local, global, regional, national, and global energy markets. We're in no way separate from them. And all of that energy extraction, processing, distribution leads to energy sprawl. Energy sprawl, that is the physical impacts on the landscape and increasingly on the waterscape as well. After agriculture, energy-related land use is probably the single greatest land use on Earth. That sprawling destruction is really just devastating to ecological integrity and in many cases also very, very harmful to human health. So some of the kinds of things we see, and we'll put these up on the tape, are mountaintop removal mining in Appalachia, decapitating mountains. And it's the same mountains that we live in, just a little bit farther down the road. We see oil and gas development fragmenting wildlife habitat. Massive amounts of that going on in the western states. We see fracking really ramping up and in the Marcellus Shale region, in the Niobrara Shale region, and other shale gas plays around the country. Truly vast quantities of fresh water which are being used and polluted for fracking. That's clearly a huge ecological issue. And then there's the tar sands development, which we all know about in Alberta, Canada. And fortunately, many, many Vermonters are helping to fight the Keystone Pipeline, which would bring even more of that unconventional tar sands derived crude oil into the US and the international energy markets. But, and here's where we segue into our conversation about wind development in Vermont. It's not just these fossil energy-based energy infrastructure that has significant impacts. We're seeing large-scale renewable energy projects also have significant ecological impacts, and they need to be discussed. We've seen concentrated solar development in the Mojave Desert on public lands, very controversial. We see that if we look at the current energy mix, we see the largest single category of so-called renewable energy is large-scale hydropower. But large dams, of course, are river killers. And in Vermont, we import a huge amount of our electricity from the wilderness-killing dams operated by Hydro-Quebec to our north. So is that green energy? It may be low emissions, but it has very profound consequences for wildlife habitat into the north. So all of this kind of energy generation requires transmission infrastructure. That also fragments habitat. It's a tremendous impact there in terms of area and wildlife consequences. Clearly, as a society, even in Vermont, I know Vermont is not the Las Vegas Strip, and we think we have an ethic of conservation and efficiency, and we do compared to some places, but we clearly still have a conversation about economic growth that assumes perpetual growth. We frame economic progress as growth. This is the religion of progress, more growth. We've still deluded that endless growth is both possible and desirable.
Right, we just saw a clip, we're going to need 200 miles of ridgeline.
Of ridgeline development, more growth, more energy to support that endless growth. So in sum, essentially this current energy economy says that no place is sacred. Nothing is safe. Nothing is out of bounds. Not the windswept prairies of Wyoming, which are being fracked, not the Marcellus Shale region and those eastern deciduous forests, not the ridgelines of Vermont, not the mountains of West Virginia, which are being decapitated, and not our children's lungs, who are breathing coal particulates from those Midwestern coal-burning power plants. So that's what the current energy economy says, and that's essentially based on the idea of the industrial worldview, that the Earth is not this living community to which we belong, but is really just a kind of a smorgasbord of resources, a storehouse of things that we can extract for human use and profit. And the industrial worldview applied to the ridgelines of New England look something like this. And that industrial worldview applied to Laurel Mountain looks like this and this. And so just to return to your question and answer it more succinctly, before we can articulate a vision of what that future energy economy should be for Vermont, we have to understand the characteristics of this current energy economy to which we are inextricably tied. That current energy economy is centralized, it's anchored by fossil fuels, and it treats the global atmosphere as an open sewer. It destroys both beauty and biological diversity heedlessly, carelessly, without a thought, in the search for efficiency and growth. And it's scaled best in its centralization. It's scaled best and most appropriately for corporate profit, not for community values. So that is the question before us. If we are really serious about moving Vermont's energy economy toward a future place that doesn't incorporate those values, does industrial wind development on Vermont ridgelines make sense? Does it move us in the right direction? Is it an incremental improvement? Or is it more of the same?
And we'll talk more about that as we develop this discussion. Thank you very much for that good overview of where, I mean, I must say, looking at your book, I really, it brings it home to what we're doing to our planet. And just as President Obama has said, we're going to develop everything. And does this make sense?
All of the above strategy.
All of the above, yeah.
All the destruction we can do.
So Steve, you've spent your career as a scientist, and when you see, for instance, what has been done to the Lowell Mountains or similarly to Georgia Mountain or Sheffield, what are your reactions to it? What do you look at the scientific approach to this?
Well, I have to say my first reaction is more aesthetic than scientific, and it's mostly a matter of being appalled, I have to say. So I guess I have to come right down and show my true colors right from the beginning.
I mean, we're taking intact ecosystems and we're building roads on them. And so how can we do it better, or should we do it, or, you know?
Well, at least it would be awfully nice if we knew a little bit more about it before we did it, and that's really where I come in. My field is what I call paleoecology, and it's not a common term, although it's fairly well known in some circles, and it has to do with looking at ecology over very long periods of time, whether it's hundreds of years or thousands or even millions of years. So I'm very much concerned about what happened since the last ice age and things like that. But I'm also particularly concerned about the last 100 years or 200 years or whatever. And of course, if you look at Vermont, you know, we always have this, everybody says, well, Vermont used to be 80% cleared when the sheep were on the land and that sort of thing. Now we're back to 80% forest. Isn't that wonderful? We're making progress. And this is like so many of these things, a pretty bad oversimplification. So when you start looking, for example, at if you had 80% cleared, which is probably not entirely true, but what about that other 20%? Where was it? And the other 20%, of course, was exactly the land we're talking about developing for wind power and other things. These are the lands that are relatively high elevation. They're not high enough to put a ski run in there. They're too rugged and the trees are too small to be very good forestry material. They're too high and rocky for farms. So they've been sitting there pretty much as close to a pristine state as anything can be in Vermont. Back towards the last ice age, let's say 10 or 15,000 years ago. So it's important that we keep in mind, I think, that there's a tendency to say, okay, it's renewable, therefore it's free. Well, it's not free. We're paying a cost. And the cost, of course, is this disruption of the closest thing we have to natural ecosystems around here. But the other side of this, and this is where I want to speak about it scientifically, is that one of the problems is we really don't know the cost at all. We have very poor control on the cost because we don't really know much about this wilderness or this pristine environment, whatever term you want to use, and we're not doing a good job of finding out anything about it. And most particularly, we're not doing a very good job of doing anything like before and after studies or controlled studies of what is actually occurring when we start building things like the Lowell Mountain Project. So I mean, the ideal situation scientifically would be to have a real before and after study, you know, a carefully controlled, unbiased study paid for by outside interest rather than by somebody with a vested interest in it. And do this in a serious fashion. Well, of course, once you've built the power plants there, you can't do it anymore. Actually, the Lowell Mountains are kind of an interesting example here because although we can't do it now we can actually make a fairly good crack at it, because roughly half of the Lowell Mountain chain has been turned into a wind energy project, and the other half is still pretty much untouched. And so we still could go back in there now, and should make some really careful studies about a number of things, like, for example, this very low frequency noise issue, which is turning out, I think almost everybody is beginning to see that this is something that just simply isn't going to go away and be ignored. Now, how would you start, or how would you design an experiment or a study to find out what was going on here? And of course, one of the first things you do is simply kind of go and scope things out and talk to people who have had some experience and know what they're doing there. And so, for example, there's some good anecdotal evidence, which and some scientists don't think is anecdotal evidence is usually not considered to be definitive, but it's how you get started. And it's suggesting that things like coyotes, hawks, things like that are being affected by a number of things, but probably the low frequency noise would be right up there among the serious ones. We don't really know until we study it. So we need to go out and make a serious evaluation of what the costs, not just the financial costs, but the environmental costs of all these projects are. And we need to do it before we allow any more to occur. Mm-hmm. My feeling personally is that these costs are so high and the returns so less than they have touted to be, that it's very difficult to make a serious case that these things should be allowed to continue, or allowed to be, that new ones should be allowed to be built there. But we can't really make the case very well until we have had until we've done some much more serious and concentrated studies. Now, this brings up the question, of course, of who's going to pay for this. These things are expensive, but they're not appallingly so. It's the sort of thing where it would be quite possible to arrange with one of the local universities or colleges to do a good job using graduate students and supervision, maybe at a level beyond that. And you can get grants for it, and you get people who would be willing to work for maybe not minimum wages, but a heck of a lot less than you're paying the consultants who are probably being, whose job it is to supposedly monitor.
So the money's being spent anyway.
Right, the money's being spent, it's just going in different directions. And what you really need is well, the thing about science, doing science, is that it's a human endeavor, and no matter how unbiased you want to be, it's very hard to do so. And this is why you have double-blind experiments in the pharmaceutical industry and that sort of thing. You need the same sort of thing here. If you have somebody going out and looking to see how many bats have been killed by the rotating blades, and that person's job depends on indicating that maybe these things really aren't so bad after all, it's going to be awfully hard for this person to really do an unbiased job, even if he or she thinks they're doing it. So you need to be able to bring in people from outside. You need to be able to have some sort of a real unbiased control on this, and you need to start doing it, and you need to bring this information to bear and make it publicly available. And we should have already done it. We need to start doing it now if any more of these things are going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Well, Sue, we've heard, I have heard repeatedly the idea that, look, with climate change, our mountains, the species are going to change, the trees are going to change. The wildlife are threatened anyway. So, from your perspective, when you look at the role that our mountains play, and especially with the connectivity and fragmentation, could you speak to, is it really okay? Do we have to sacrifice the mountains in order to save the planet?
No, it's really a nightmare. I worked my whole career in conservation and environmental advocacy and teaching and the like, and the last several years with these wind proposals and other energy endeavors in other parts of the country, all under the banner of green energy, it's truly a nightmare.
Well, so in your field, there's developing cumulative effects assessments. Could you speak about that?
Let me just address your question first, because I don't want to lose track. You know, it's a nightmare that I'm afraid, going to really regret, all of us. And for those of you in the audience who aren't decided on the subject, I really implore you to listen to what we have to say today and do whatever you can to educate yourselves, because there are a lot of unanswered questions here, and this is a ruinous business. It's not a nightmare. We are awake, and it's real, and it's happening all around us. As for cumulative effects, that is the kind of science I think that Steve is addressing. The cumulative effects assessment is recognized worldwide by serious scientists as at least a toe in the water means of really truly assessing the cumulative multitudinous effects that we have caused to happen in our natural world, and causing harm to wildlife and ecosystem services and virtually the entire system. So each event, each effect, if you will, is a separate single effect, and we've done really well for decades in saying, well, this effect is just going to have a negligible impact on wildlife, so this is acceptable. We'll mitigate in this way. And this effect over here, well, this is going to do this, but it's here and now, and it doesn't seem to be serious, so that's okay. But what now scientists are recognizing is that cumulatively, all these separate, seemingly benign effects are now definitely interacting, sometimes synergistically, cumulatively, call it what you will, to impact wildlife in serious ways. And I think we're seeing that now with moose, for example. All across North America, wherever you know and love moose, those populations are in decline. Even here, where just a few years ago I would have said, well, for some reason New England's spared, I don't get it, but the Jackson Hole herd in Wyoming is crashing because of carotid artery worm, and the moose in Minnesota are crashing, they think, because of a combination of global climate change and parasites and so on. It's happening here now. And my point, if I can make it, is everything we do up in those wild mountains affects these animals. Every walk we take, every tour we take to visit an energy facility that doesn't belong up there, but it's up there now on the Lowell Mountain, is impacting animals. It's causing them harm, it's frightening them, it's causing them to blow their energy budget at a time when they can least afford it, for example. It's causing them to not forage in preferred habitats because of human infrastructure. As a consequence of that, they may not have enough weight to carry their offspring and birth their young appropriately in the spring, or sustain that growing young with adequate milk and nutrition. So there's lots of little things that are now suddenly all coming together and impacting wildlife. Moose all across North America are definitely struggling, and in our ecosystem here, all across the spine of the mountains, all the entire length of northern New England and the Adirondacks too, we need to keep these places whole. We need to allow wildlife to move about them free and unfettered by our activities. In other words, that's their home. How would we feel if someone came up, set up shop in our bedrooms, put up, 400-foot towers in our bedrooms? It's just totally unacceptable. These animals have to be able to respond to climate change. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. Some may need to change their range altogether to find more northerly habitats or whatever they need to do. They're not going to get there from here if we keep breaking up the habitat. That's called fragmentation, and that's what's going on. That was your first question. Fragmentation worldwide is recognized. The serious scientists are all pointing to that as a very serious issue. We can't keep breaking it apart and expecting habitat to function, and certainly in the emergency that's going to face wildlife as well as ourselves, it's got to be there. My favorite conservationist, Aldo Leopold, said it best. He said, the first rule in intelligent tinkering is to save all the pieces. We have some marvelous pieces in New England, and I think we should be saving them. Carte blanche, no development whatsoever anymore in our core habitats, and we should to add to that, be really seriously bringing the science that Steve talks about to bear to help us understand what are the important connective habitats and really add to the mix of conserved habitats so that we can allow the rest of life its place on the planet.
Well, Bruce, we've heard that Vermont has plenty of mountains and they're natural towers. So you've been looking into the history of Vermont's mountains, and you're going to provide us with a little grounding in really probably busting some myths of what we all believed in our pristine green state, but also bring us sort of up to date, up to speed on how we have either protected or used our mountains and where we might go from here.
Oh, certainly, but first of all, thanks for inviting me to be part of Peak Keepers. There's an expression, last but not least. In this case, I am the least. I consider all of you my teachers, and I've come to this fairly recently, within the last 2 years, because of historical research and some writing I've been doing on Vermont environmental history. And even before I get into that, I just want to react quickly to something each of the panelists have said. You know, Sue, when you were talking about cumulative impact, I was thinking, you know, it's maybe possible to shake a champagne bottle to have the cork eventually blow off, and if the cork blows off, you think it's the last shake that did it. But no, it's every shake that went into it prior to that. That's a cumulative effect. And Steve, you talked about studies and double-blind studies, and you know, we hear from the wind industry there's no problem with things. I know we heard from years from the cigarette industry that cigarette smoking was not harmful to your health, and then we found out differently. And Tom talked about the image of Vermont as a green oasis, and two, we have this image of ourselves as being an environmental paradigm for the rest of the nation to follow.
And we have to lead the way.
You know, when I was a student at Norwich, I started as a freshman in '65. I had a bank account down in Depot Square, and they had two pictures framed on the wall, and I looked up, it was Northfield in the 19th century, probably around the mid-1800s, with the hills totally barren. If you looked east, you'd see Turkey Hill, and which was right over the bank I went to, and it was completely stripped in 1860. So we identified that with sheep mania at the time. But even in the 1920s, you could look west over the train station in Northfield and see the hills still stripped. But I learned there was something called railroad mania. The trains would stop every 20 miles to get fueled by all the trees we cut down. They needed the wood to fuel the image. So that was, you know, I call that the first wave of destruction that I learned about, or the first mania. The second wave of destruction was the birth of the ski industry. In 1939, George Aiken signed the permission slip as governor for the Mount Mansfield ski area to build ski towers, the first chairlift up Mount Mansfield. Eventually started in 1941. Popular Mechanics magazine had a great article on it. And Aiken was criticized as desecrating the mountains, you know. Fast forward 30 years later to 1969, Jim Jeffords, one of my old bosses, was the Attorney General of the state of Vermont, and he had a news conference. You know, Stowe used to call itself the ski capital of the East. Jeffords called them at the time the sewage capital of the East because of all the pollution that was being dumped out of unregulated systems into the river, and there had been enormous growth in the ski industry in Stowe. Well, you know, that kind of growth hasn't abated either. I have a photo. The research I've been doing, I have a photo of Jay Peak in 1934, taken by the National Park Service architects who were planning a national park and part of this Green Mountain Parkway issue. And you see the same summit today. It's got ski areas, and then you see some of the advertising they do for developing, getting investors from abroad through this strange EB-5 visa program. For $500,000, you get sort of a get out of jail free pass to come into the United States. And they're marketing this to people who have absolutely no appreciation for what our mountains are and what the homes are for us, and also for the animal, the flora and the fauna of the mountains. And they're advertising, they're continuing, this is continuing to go on. So that's the second wave of destruction, or you call it the second mania. And the third mania is wind development. And I thought it was really interesting several months ago when Lawrence Pine, the outdoor editor from the Burlington Free Press, did a great article where he said, he'd been sort of on the fence, but when he looked at what was happening to Lowell Mountain and hearing that we needed to have 5, 6 more Lowell Mountains, or 200 miles, as that our opening sequence showed, of ridgetop wind, I think that, to me, gives the lie to our environmental reputation. And I believe we have to wake up before it's too late to take steps to save what we have and not continue to degrade it.
Well, from a scientific perspective, one of the things that I've been really trying to understand for the last 4 years is, do wind turbines actually address climate change and reduce fossil fuel consumption? And Steve, I think this is something that you've been sort of puzzling over too. And what amazes me is how many people are just willing to believe that it's true, and you're making this leap without connecting the dots. And we're seeing now more curtailment of the wind projects during peak loads. There's obviously issues that haven't been worked out. And Steve, what do you think, what would you like to know, or what do you need to know to be persuaded that this is actually doing what is claimed that it's doing?
It'd be very hard to persuade me at this point, I think. And again, I appeal back to, as a scientist nonetheless, I appeal to the aesthetic point of view. It's costing an awful lot to look at those towers and to see and to look at the footage you're showing here of what those towers are sitting on, and look at the red lights going on every night. It would go a long way towards convincing me if I didn't see so many potential for unintended consequences, and starting to see already some, I don't know whether they're intended or not, but when you start seeing, as we hear over and over again, the inadequacy of the transmission system. Now, I'm confused about this, because several years ago, before the Lowell Mountain project was ever started, it was brought up repeatedly that this was likely to be a problem. So it wasn't really a surprise. In a sense, it's hard to call it an unintended consequence. But in a political system, I suppose in a certain sense it is. It was intended to build the structures, not build the whole system.
So then the solution is to build more. So Tom, you've been cataloging what that looks like in terms of
energy sprawl.
Yeah.
Yeah. And well, part of this is an interesting point with large-scale wind developments, with both solar and wind. What you're doing is you're trying to capture energy that's fairly diffuse, whereas fossil energy resources have had the benefit of a million years of being cooked by nature into very, very concentrated energy sources. This is kind of a basic, fundamental topic in energy literacy, this idea of energy density. And the one fun way to think about it is, we carpooled here. Well, if instead of going back home, we decided to push our car instead of turn on the engine, could we get it back down the road? Well, we're fairly fit, some of us more than others. We could all group together and we could push the car down the road, but it would take a tremendous amount of effort to do, for human muscles, to do the labor of what this much of fossil energy as gasoline can do. It can push us down that 3,000 pound car, 60 miles down the road, lickety-split. No trouble. That is energy density of liquid hydrocarbons in action. And there's a difference, of course, when you're trying to capture this diffuse energy. You need a lot more space to capture that, and that leads to energy sprawl. Now, this isn't an argument at all for continuing to burn coal and decapitate mountains, but it's a factor that we need to consider when large-scale, industrial-scale wind development is being touted as a green or renewable resource. We have to look carefully at that. What was the embodied energy? What is the total carbon emissions from all those trucks, all those loads of gravel, all those explosives that were manufactured somewhere and were used to scalp part of Lowell Mountain? What was the emissions consequences of deforesting an intact high elevation habitat, one of these last strongholds of wild nature that you discussed? What was the carbon emissions impact of the forest soils that were intact reservoirs of carbon as that pulse of carbon was lost? There's also a huge amount of energy, embodied energy in the concrete pads, in the steel towers, in the carbon fiber blades or whatever material you're using, in all the electronics. If you do a kind of a life cycle analysis of that and you want to audit, what's the payback time to get from that to kind of a carbon emissions 0 point? I'd be really curious to know. How many years or decades, or if ever, are you actually saving any carbon emissions from this sort of large-scale industrial wind development?
And that's something we just don't know.
Well, plus, we're just empowering us to just continue living a lifestyle that is really not sustainable. I mean, that's where that's the line in the sand that I like to draw on behalf of the animals, I suppose, not in all appropriate humility. I just really feel that it's time for us to step back and draw the line and say, okay, we're not going to destroy any more of the planet. We're going to turn to ourselves and arrive at new energies. Local energies, energies that make sense based on community consensus. I'm not an engineer. I don't know what they will be and what configuration they'll show up in, but I really feel that we can't keep doing this. This is just more of the same.
It is more of the same. If you're talking about large-scale renewables, whether it's concentrated solar, industrial-scale wind, large dam hydro, you're still buying into a sort of centralized corporate utility, investor-owned utility, corporate model of centralized generation and broad-scale distribution, which is the old model for delivering energy. That is not going to be the future. So then the question becomes, and people of good, well-meaning and friends of mine can disagree about this. How fast and how effectively are we going to get to that more benign energy future? And does large-scale wind help us get there incrementally, even as we move toward a distributed, decentralized, appropriately scaled energy generation scenario? If it were the case, if it really were, we knew that this was going to help that large-scale industry. Let's say we needed 200 or 500 miles of ridgelines destroyed in Vermont, and that could solve the climate change problem. If it could, maybe you'd sacrifice Vermont. But the reality is it's not going to do that.
And at the same time, we're simultaneously sacrificing Alberta, the Southern Appalachians.
Exactly.
In other words,
all of the above.
Yeah.
And this sort of large-scale wind development, which is corporate profit-centered and scaled for corporate profit, not to support community values, is going to perpetuate the current energy economy, even while the fuel source goes from coal or fracked natural gas or tar sands-derived fuel to a renewable. So it doesn't actually move us forward very well or very fast.
I'm a child of the 60s, and I went to a military school and was ready to go to Vietnam. I remember the saying that came out, this company commander said something, we destroyed the village in order to save it. And that's what I hear coming from some of the ridgetop wind destruction, and it is destruction, proponents. Well, we have to do this to save Vermont. And
we'll destroy the mountains to save the planet.
Yeah, and it's
Well, and also that we have to build wind, or else what do you want? This? What do you want? Mountaintop removal. there is this deflection that we're not really having the conversation. And that's one of the things that we're
That's
doing
a false
with
choice.
the peak keepers. So, for instance, Vermont's Ridgeline wind resource was discussed in the previous show, and we hope people will watch the first peak keeper show. We really don't want to repeat. And so Will Amadon, who's a geology professor at Middlebury College, spoke to that. Well, Bruce, as someone who's worked on policy with elected officials, here we've got essentially all of our leadership, both nationally and statewide, supporting this continuing energy sprawl. Do you have any perspective on how the people can have a voice in, especially in Vermont, with our small town communities, with our rural, we can work together. How do we get the elected officials on the same page with what most Vermonters seem to want, which is community energy, in which we are really well positioned for?
Well, having worked for a lot of public servants, and some really good ones, Bob Stafford, for instance, had a stellar record in the United States Senate and was overlooked in a column the other day that even mentioned his role, which I thought was crazy. But many politicians are motivated by fear, and they're also motivated by money. And we live in a system today where there's such a disconnect between our supposed representatives and us. And the other thing that confuses me, disappoints me, troubles me, is how many of our so-called environmental organizations seem to have totally bought in to this whole question of environmental destruction. I used to live in North Dakota for a little while, and I remember they had a humorous billboard campaign to encourage people to go to North Dakota. One said, stay in North Dakota, Custer was healthy when he left. But then there was another billboard, and I made a facsimile. It was an actual billboard. It said, North Dakota, mountaintop removal project completed. And the interesting thing about that to me is I thought about it, getting ready for this, is they had billboards in North Dakota, but no mountaintops to remove. We come to Vermont, and we pride ourselves in the fact we don't have billboards, but we're busy removing our mountaintops. And that's got the support of a lot of organizations. There's one photo from Lowell of this big cut through the rocks that I think is emblematic with what's wrong with a lot of our organizations. I can't understand, for instance, why Conservation Law Foundation in New Hampshire is against this Northern Pass, this big utility project coming down from Quebec that wants to go through New Hampshire to southern New England, bring down massive amounts of power, and they're objecting to it in New Hampshire. 85-foot tall towers, wide rights of way, destroying pristine or non-harmed environment. And yet in Vermont, their sister organization is supporting wind development. I have a bumper sticker here. I used to belong to the Sierra Club in Vermont, restore our wild green mountains, and yet they're now big supporters of it. Maybe it should read, I don't think they'd have the audaciousness to say destroy our wild green mountains, but that's what they're doing. And I just, so.
Maybe they mean restore our destroyed green mountains.
Well, they have to fast forward. But that's why I think some of the politicians and some of the environmental groups and some of us are looking for easy solutions.
Right, our hair's on fire. People are literally freaking out about climate change, and
as they should be.
Yes, this is
rightfully.
This is an immediate. It's happening. We're not denying this is happening. Steve, you worked in your paleoecology. I'm learning a new word. Paleoecology work. That looking at long term. So, what does the future look like for what might people who are worried expect as the climate does change?
Oh boy, that's an interesting question. I mean, it's one of the things, of course, we had to face is that the climate is changing, and it always has been changing, but it's changing faster now than it has really any time we know of.
It's really extreme weather that we're seeing,
and it's going to keep on. There's no question about it. What we're going to be seeing, what our great-grandchildren are going to be seeing, is a lot less balsam fir spruce forest. Maybe we'll get our lynx back for a few years, and then our lynx will go away again and head north where they can find a reasonable habitat. It's probably going to, in Vermont we're very lucky in a sense. We're probably going to have less effect than a lot of other places. We're probably not going to go into a major drought situation. We're probably not going to we may find ourselves more like Virginia than Vermont, but we'll still have plenty of water.
Which others might want to come and get.
Exactly, and this is a really important thing because we are part of the overall world, and we're going to see the changes that are going to occur in the world are going to be, in a sense, environmental changes, but they're going to present themselves as being social changes, and they're going to present themselves with more riots in a place like Egypt, where the price of food is going up because of the droughts in other parts of the world, and the fact we're burning a lot of corn for gasoline and that sort of thing. So this is what we're going to see is and of course an increasing population all the time. What we'll see is that kind of an issue, and the loss of balsam fir trees will be kind of lost in the background, I think. There's another thing, while I'm talking here, something else I'd just like to throw out, and it's a story which I thought about earlier on. But somewhere back in the 60s, my dad was a lister in the town of Wolcott, a tax assessor, and he worked with another guy by the name of Scott. And he and Scott ran the local, he was the engineer at the local power station, which is the village of Hardwick, which supplied the power for the Wolcott area. 1967, I think it was, I was living in Boston, and all of a sudden everything went black. You know, all the lights everywhere went out. There was a great New England power shortage, and it was scary. And it messed up a lot of things. That was before Y2K and computers, but you can imagine what it would have done. Well, Mr. Scott was down at the local power station, which is on the border between Wolcott and Hardwick, and he saw these gauges doing really funny things, and he pulled the plug. He pulled the switch, and the only place in New England that I know of that didn't have a power shortage, didn't have a blackout, was the Hardwick area.
Its own microgrid.
Exactly, and this is really important. This to me is you know, all the talk in Vermont about locavores, about our local economies and all this sort of thing, how important this is. And we seem to totally ignore this with regard to our power. Now, if you took the amount of money that we have been spending, including our tax money, on building wind projects, and turned that into small local projects that were sustainable and which were flexible and which allowed for the possibilities of some kinds of major disasters on a bigger scale. Think what we could have accomplished with that sort of thing.
We've actually seen $1 billion spent, that's the wind developers' money, on wind development in New England to build about 750 megawatts, which is and then it's operating at about 24% capacity. So we're getting a relatively small amount of power that is causing issues with the grid, and where are the benefits to our communities? And we're seeing the same thing happen with solar.
Where are the benefits to our community? And that's the question that we all ask, because after all, we're humans, but we really also, in the mix of all this, ought to be asking about the other lives that are out there. And you know, they have energy budgets too, and they have economies too, if you will. And moose, for example, a warming climate, increasing temperatures, especially in late winter when they still have their winter coat on, a disaster, okay? You add to that the stresses associated with roads and people and disturbances and who knows, maybe dogs and skiers. I mean, I'm not gonna pick on anybody. Me, up there for a walk.
How many of you were up on the Lowells before they were blasted away? And what did you see? covered with moose droppings.
Yeah.
Just everywhere. It was one of the most alive places.
And you must realize that these mountains are not just habitat for the animals that live there, the moose, the bear, the newly returning lynx, the bobcat, whatever, the eagles. They are also corridors, or I prefer to say preferred travel routes that these animals move along as they move from habitat to habitat. The young moose that leave their mothers and disperse, this is how they move about the larger landscape to go to the Adirondacks, for example. So we are unraveling the very fabric of the larger habitats that we must keep intact to facilitate resilience and just health in ecosystems in terms of animal well-being. And you know, just put yourselves in the body of an animal out there and ask yourself how that feels. Take a look at these images. This is the before on the mountain, and this is the after. And these are all the people that are walking around in the habitat that was yours. Do these animals get a ticket? Do they get a Visa card? Do they get to move somewhere else? Some of them successfully do move. Many probably don't.
So if Vermont were to be a leader on energy and on environmental protection, what would that look like?
Well, I'll take a stab at it. Again, this is in the kind of in the realm of the abstract and less the specific, but going back to the characteristics of that current energy economy, which is centralized, corporate scaled, anchored by fossil fuels, destructive of beauty and biodiversity, and using the global atmosphere as an open sewer, our future energy economy, if we were truly serious about moving towards sustainability, would basically turn that 180 degrees. And we'd quit talking about how can we have more and more and more energy and ask, well, not how much energy do we need to grow the economy, but how much energy can nature sustainably supply to us while we're still leaving plenty of room for our non-human wild neighbors to flourish. So we'd flip that question. We'd look at that energy budget, and we would try to create an energy economy that supported a durable, resilient, steady state economy with flourishing human communities embedded in this matrix of wild nature. And we would look for not a corporate scale energy generation mix, but one that was distributed and decentralized and resilient and supported community values and not corporate profit. And one essentially that was anchored to the maximum of extent by renewables, even while understanding that we will get there incrementally. The fossil fuel energy era is not going to go away quickly.
I mean, for a while we had this myth, or this idea of peak oil.
Well, that is not a myth.
But it's shifting in terms of we've ramped it up more.
We can hold two seemingly contrary ideas in our head. That one, there is a whole lot of fossil hydrocarbons in the Earth's crust. If we burn them all, we can cook ourselves.
That's right.
While the very inexpensive, easily accessible, most high-quality fossil energy resources have peaked. And the net energy return on fossil energy extraction is going down. So peak oil is not a myth.
Right,
but it is also not the case that we're simply going to run out and that's going to solve the climate change.
I mean, what's next after fracking? Methane hydrate.
Exactly.
Well, and not only is the net energy quality gone down, but the environmental degradation is going up. I mean, look at oil shale, for heaven's sake. I mean, tar sands. It's nuts.
Right.
Nuts.
So there's all these unconventional fossil energy resources that are lower net energy and higher ecological impact to exploit. That is where we're going.
Well, I want to pick up on something both of you said, and it relates many ways to going forward. Folks that have been rallying in terms of protecting our mountain ecology have been pilloried in many ways by industry groups, by some of the politicians who are supporting these groups and what they want to do as being NIMBYs and negative.
Just short of crazy.
Having no alternatives, and you've started talking about an alternative for the distribution, decentralized generation and distribution of electricity. And Steve mentioned the locavore movement. I have a really close friend who's a former secretary of ANR, and she says that her point of view is that the future of activism and positive visions for protecting our environment in Vermont will come from small, ad hoc, decentralized groups, just as it did in the mid-'60s when folks like Hub Vogelman and Bob Spear up at the Birds of Vermont Museum, Shirley Strong from the Green Mountain Club, Roland Wilbur, who I think was a doctor, and they formed this Green Mountain Profile Committee to preserve our high altitude environment. Well, they didn't belong to any necessarily large environmental group that was depending on contributions to stay in business that probably causes them to pull their punches. They were committed to something. And this is my great admiration for the folks, I call them the Lowell Mountain Group. Well, their mountain's already been degraded. They could have just said, well, let's forget about it, let other people fight their battles. Their commitment to the future of our mountain ecology statewide is admirable.
And to learn from the mistakes that have been made.
And their commitment is catching,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
And I think that is something that gives me some hope for the future. And that's perhaps one of the reasons we're doing something like this today. It's that educational effort of peak keepers and others like peak keepers to give people some hope, some knowledge, and some direction for going forward.
Well, I live off-grid with solar, and I have for 27 years, and I've been following the energy markets for quite a while, and I see that the technology is moving in the direction of microgrids, and exactly what's perfect for Vermont. So we have a lot of work to do in changing over from this centralized system to a decentralized system, and you know, we're part of what Big Wind is doing is fueling more grid, $10 billion worth of development, bigger and more, same thing with moving more Hydro-Quebec power in. And so really finding these Vermont scale solutions can be leading the way for other states where we are respecting our people. We're seeing a lot of people harmed by the noise from the wind turbines, and can only imagine what it's doing to the wildlife, and the soundscape has changed when they are trying to. So I think there is some hope in what's going on. And the other thing is that when I look at Vermont's mountains, when we look at those areas that are under threat, there really don't seem to be that many developable mountains. And that may be one piece of hope too, that we do have the threats, for instance, of the Deerfield Wind Project, which would be on U.S. Forest Service land and could open up the whole Green Mountain National Forest.
It set a terrible precedent.
Oh, of course. Yeah.
And next to the George D. Aiken Wilderness, which is 1.5 miles away. So that's sort of one of the critical points that Vermonters really need to be watching. But in terms of this going forward, the idea that we can have the Hardwick microgrid, that it actually did work back in the 60s, I think is a sign of hope for people who want to do something, who are feeling like they really need to do something about climate change and to try and work on this new structure.
Sure, there's a lot to do. And part of one happy effect of the fact of how bad our current system is there's lots of room for incremental improvement with policy changes and personal action. The fact that we're such a wasteful society of energy, that we use about twice as much energy per capita as a typical person in Western Europe, and as far as I know, I've never been to Paris, but I understand the food there is good and the lights actually come on when you flip the switch. We've got a lot of room still to pick the low-hanging fruit in energy efficiency and conservation. We can use a lot less and still live very well without sacrificing Vermont's ridgelines to high elevation wind factories.
I would hope that our leadership, both in Washington and locally, would really lead us into such actions.
One would hope so, but if one is waiting for that sort of leadership at a national level, I think one will be waiting for a long time.
Yeah, but that's tragic, and there's where people need to speak out and people need to be heard. I think an awful lot of people are on the fence right now about this. They haven't necessarily been privy to the information that we're trying to share, and good heavens, there's plenty more where this came from. But I really feel that people just need to get involved and watch your back, watch the mountain behind you, because you know anything goes. I really think towns need to gear up for this.
Well, I've been doing a lot of research on the creation of the national parks, and there's a guy out in Washington State named, I think, Alfred Runte, who wrote a book on the national parks. But he said recently that we're beginning to take them for granted. We have to learn to love our national parks again. Well, I think the same thing with our mountains here in Vermont. I know the last panel said, oh, we love our mountains. Even the governor said, oh, I love our mountains. Although I don't agree with the way he shows his love. But all of us, I think we have to learn to love our mountains again.
Get out in nature.
But we have to learn too, it's just about, and you've said it very eloquently and knowledgeably, Sue, we're just not talking about the top of the ridge. That's not the mountain, it's the flanks, it's the region, it's this whole, again, cumulative presence of the mountains in Vermont, which are what make us very distinctive. And to sacrifice this, to me, is unconscionable.
And Steve, do you have any closing comments you'd like to make?
Oh, I think that we covered the ground pretty well.
Good. Well, we're going to wrap up now, and we'll be putting up a blog that people can come and get more information. And I want to thank you all for this very informative and, I hope, inspiring discussion, which we will continue. So thank you.